You open that?
She can fit in here.
I mean, she's in there. Oh, she's in there.
Police department. Police department. Hi, how's it going?
Yeah.
Are you Patricia?
No, I'm her daughter here.
Patricia here?
No, she's not here. No, she's the sister.
I'm just asking because someone was worried they didn't know where she was
My
at.
son John and him and her are having a little bit of a tiff because he owes her quite a bit of money. He's been trying to call her for 24 hours now. And I gave her the message yesterday.
A welfare check is one of the most routine calls police officers receive. Most end quietly. A concerned family member makes a call. An officer knocks on a door. A conversation takes place. And within minutes, everyone moves on with their day. But every so often, a welfare check becomes something else entirely. A doorway into a mystery. A search for answers. The beginning of a homicide investigation. In January of 2020, police in Roseville, Michigan, received a request that appeared no different from countless others they had handled before. A grandson was worried about his grandmother. 69-year-old Patricia Bennett had stopped communicating with family members. Calls went unanswered. Messages received no response. Days turned into weeks. Something felt wrong. The silence was becoming impossible to ignore. For relatives who knew Patricia, the lack of contact was alarming. They needed answers. So they asked police to check on her welfare. At approximately 10 o'clock that morning, officers arrived at a home on Congress Street in Roseville. What they expected to find was a woman who might be ill, away from home, or simply avoiding contact. Instead, according to investigators, they were met with a series of explanations that immediately raised concerns. Police would later say that the stories they were hearing about Patricia's whereabouts did not seem to add up. The answers were vague. The circumstances were unusual. Something about the situation felt off. As officers continued asking questions, their concern grew. This was no longer a routine welfare check. The person standing before them was Patricia's daughter, 50-year-old Carol Rey. And according to investigators, the more they looked into Patricia's disappearance, the more suspicious the situation became. Police eventually decided they needed to look deeper. A search warrant was obtained. Investigators began examining the property. Hours after officers first arrived, the case took a devastating turn. Inside a detached garage, authorities made a discovery that would transform the entire investigation. Patricia Bennett was dead. What began as concern for a missing grandmother had suddenly become a homicide case. But investigators would soon uncover even more disturbing allegations. According to police, Patricia had not died days earlier. They believed she had been dead for weeks, possibly since November of the previous year. Prosecutors would later allege that she had been shot and that her body had been concealed inside a large plastic storage container in the garage. As detectives worked to piece together what happened, another troubling picture began to emerge. Investigators alleged that after Patricia's death, someone had continued sending text messages from her phone. Family members who believed they were communicating with Patricia may not have been communicating with her at all. Authorities would later claim that messages were sent in an effort to make it appear that she was still alive. The investigation did not stop there. Detectives also began examining financial activity connected to Patricia's accounts. Questions surfaced about money. Questions surfaced about motive. And questions surfaced about what had allegedly been happening inside that house for months before anyone discovered the truth. Within days, Carol Rey would find herself facing some of the most serious criminal charges available under Michigan law, including first-degree murder. Prosecutors alleged that the victim's own daughter was responsible for her death. Tonight, we examine the death of Patricia Bennett. We follow the timeline from a family's growing concern to the shocking discovery inside a detached garage. What happened to Patricia Bennett? Why did family members believe she was still alive? What evidence convinced investigators that a homicide had occurred? And how did a simple welfare check uncover a secret that authorities say had been hidden for months? This is the case of Patricia Bennett and the investigation that led police to accuse her own daughter, Carol Rey, of murder. Before examining the investigation, it's important to understand who Patricia Bennett was. Because behind every homicide case is a person whose life existed long before police reports, court filings, and headlines. Patricia Bennett was 69 years old. She was a mother. A grandmother. A woman whose absence would eventually trigger the chain of events that uncovered the truth. Those who knew Patricia described her as someone who remained connected to family. She was not a stranger drifting through life unnoticed. She had children. Grandchildren. People who expected to hear from her. People who noticed when something was wrong. And that fact would become critically important. Because in many missing person cases, investigators face an immediate challenge. No one knows exactly when the person vanished. No one notices right away. Days or even weeks can pass before concern turns into action. But Patricia's case was different. Family members were accustomed to hearing from her. Communication was part of her normal routine. Whether through phone calls, text messages, or everyday conversations, Patricia maintained contact with the people closest to her. That regular communication created a pattern. And when that pattern suddenly changed, family members noticed. At first, the silence may not have seemed alarming. Everyone misses a call occasionally. Everyone gets busy. Everyone has days when they don't immediately respond to messages. But as more time passed, concern began to grow. The unanswered calls started to accumulate. The responses family members expected never arrived. And those closest to Patricia began asking questions. Where was she? Why wasn't she responding? Was she sick? Had something happened? Or was there another explanation entirely? At the center of that concern was Patricia's family. Public reporting shows that Patricia maintained relationships with relatives who remained involved in her life. That network of family connections would ultimately play a major role in bringing attention to her disappearance. Without that concern, investigators might never have been called. Without that concern, the truth may have remained hidden much longer. As detectives would later learn, the people searching for answers were not acting on a vague feeling. They were reacting to behavior that was completely out of character. Patricia's silence was unusual. And unusual behavior often becomes one of the earliest warning signs in a missing person investigation. The contrast is important. Nothing about Patricia's life suggested that she was preparing to disappear. There were no public reports indicating she had planned to leave town. There were no reports suggesting she intended to cut off contact with loved ones. There was no obvious reason for family members to suddenly stop hearing from her. From their perspective, she had simply vanished. Yet while family members were growing increasingly worried, messages continued to arrive from Patricia's phone. To relatives receiving those communications, it may have appeared that Patricia was still alive and simply unavailable. But investigators would later allege something far more troubling. According to police, some of those messages were not actually being sent by Patricia at all. Authorities alleged that texts were sent after her death in an effort to create the appearance that she was still communicating with loved ones. If true, it meant family members were unknowingly being reassured by messages that concealed a horrifying reality. As weeks passed, concern became urgency. The questions became harder to ignore. The explanations became harder to believe. And one family member, in particular, reached a breaking point. Patricia's grandson could not shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The silence had lasted too long. The circumstances no longer made sense. He wanted answers. And he was unwilling to simply accept that everything was fine. That decision would change everything. Because the welfare check he requested would set in motion a homicide investigation that investigators say exposed months of deception. A routine call. A worried grandson. A grandmother no one could reach. What seemed at first like a missing person concern was about to become one of the most shocking criminal investigations Roseville had seen in years. And investigators were only beginning to uncover what had allegedly been happening behind closed doors. As concern grew among Patricia Bennett's family members, investigators would later begin reconstructing a timeline. It is a process familiar to homicide detectives. When did anyone last see the victim alive? Who spoke with them? What communications can be verified? And at what point does ordinary silence become evidence that something may have gone terribly wrong? According to investigators, the answers in Patricia's case would eventually lead them back several weeks before police ever arrived at the home on Congress Street. By the time officers conducted the welfare check in January of 2020, prosecutors would later allege that Patricia had already been dead for months. But nobody knew that yet. From the family's perspective, Patricia was simply unreachable. And that uncertainty created a growing sense of unease. Initially, relatives tried the simplest solution. They called her phone. When she didn't answer, they called again. Then again. And again. Like many families, they assumed there might be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps she was busy. Perhaps she had misplaced her phone. Perhaps she simply didn't feel like talking. But as days passed, those explanations became harder to accept. The silence continued. Yet something made the situation even more confusing. Messages were still being received. According to investigators, family members continued receiving text communications that appeared to come from Patricia. To someone on the outside, that might seem reassuring. If messages were arriving, surely Patricia was alive. Surely there was no reason to panic. But something about those communications reportedly felt unusual to some relatives. The responses did not completely ease their concerns. Questions remained. And uncertainty continued to grow. As investigators would later allege, those messages were creating a false sense of normalcy. According to police, Patricia was not the person sending them. Instead, authorities believed the communications were part of an effort to convince family members that nothing was wrong. At the time, however, nobody knew that. Family members were left trying to make sense of conflicting information. Patricia wasn't answering calls. But messages continued to appear. She wasn't speaking directly with loved ones. But there always seemed to be an explanation. The result was confusion. And confusion can delay answers. As the weeks passed, family members began asking increasingly urgent questions. Was Patricia sick? Had she suffered a medical emergency? Was she staying somewhere else? Had she left unexpectedly? Was she intentionally avoiding contact? Every possibility had to be considered. Yet none of them seemed to fully explain what was happening. The people closest to Patricia understood her habits. They knew what was normal. And they knew this wasn't it. As concern intensified, attention naturally shifted toward the people who had the most direct knowledge of Patricia's daily life. One of those people was her daughter, Carol Rey. At the time, Carol was 50 years old. She was not a distant relative. She was Patricia's daughter and, according to investigators, someone with direct access to information about her mother's whereabouts. As family members searched for answers, explanations reportedly emerged regarding why Patricia was unavailable. But according to police, those explanations would eventually become part of the investigation itself. Detectives would later scrutinize statements, timelines, and communications in an effort to determine what was true and what was not. At this stage of the story, however, there were no homicide charges. No crime scene. No public allegations of murder. Only a family trying to locate a loved one. And a growing number of unanswered questions. The passage of time only made those questions more urgent. Days became weeks. Weeks stretched into months. The longer Patricia remained unseen, the more unusual the situation became. For investigators looking back, this period would become critically important. Every phone call. Every text message. Every reported sighting. Every explanation. All of it would later be examined in extraordinary detail. Because somewhere within that timeline was the moment when the truth disappeared behind a carefully constructed illusion. Yet while family members worried and searched for answers, they had no idea what investigators would eventually uncover. They did not know that prosecutors would later allege Patricia had been killed long before the welfare check. They did not know that a homicide investigation was quietly waiting beneath the surface. And they certainly did not know that the person at the center of that investigation would be someone from within Patricia's own family. For now, all they knew was that something felt wrong. The calls continued. The questions continued. The concern continued. Eventually, one relative decided that waiting any longer was no longer an option. The grandson who had grown increasingly worried reached a conclusion. If Patricia would not answer the phone, someone needed to physically check on her. That decision would trigger a routine police response. A welfare check. A simple request for officers to make contact with an elderly woman. But within hours, that routine call would uncover evidence that investigators say pointed toward a far darker reality than anyone had imagined. On the morning of January 16, 2020, officers from the Roseville Police Department arrived at a residence on Congress Street. At first, there was nothing to suggest that this call would become anything more than a routine welfare check. The request itself was straightforward. A family member had reported concerns about Patricia Bennett. No one had been able to reach her. No one knew where she was. Police were simply being asked to make contact and confirm that she was safe. These kinds of calls happen every day across the country. Most end within minutes. An officer knocks on a door. A resident answers. Questions are asked. Concerns are resolved. Case closed. But this call would not end that way. As officers approached the property, they began carrying out standard procedures. They assessed the residence. They looked for signs of activity. They attempted to determine whether anyone was home. Nothing about the initial moments indicated the horrific discovery that awaited them later that day. At some point during the welfare check, officers made contact with the home's occupants. Among them was Patricia Bennett's daughter, Carol Rey. Investigators began asking a simple question. Where was Patricia? The answer should have been easy. But according to police, it wasn't. As officers continued speaking with those at the residence, they reportedly received explanations regarding Patricia's whereabouts. Yet investigators would later say that the information they were hearing created more questions than answers. The details were unclear. The circumstances seemed unusual. And officers found themselves facing a situation that did not fit the pattern of a normal welfare check. Experienced investigators often talk about instinct. Not a supernatural feeling. Not a guess. But the recognition that something doesn't fit. A detail that seems out of place. An explanation that raises more questions than it answers. According to authorities, that is exactly what began happening on Congress Street. The longer officers remained at the residence, the more concerned they became. What should have been a simple verification was becoming increasingly complicated. Where exactly was Patricia? When had anyone last seen her? Why had family members been unable to reach her for so long? And why did the answers seem so difficult to verify? As investigators continued gathering information, the welfare check began evolving into something more serious. Officers were no longer simply trying to locate a missing woman. They were attempting to determine whether the information they were being given was accurate. Every answer led to another question. Every question led to another uncertainty. The concern that had started with Patricia's family was now being shared by law enforcement. At some point, investigators reached a critical decision. They needed to look deeper. The situation no longer appeared routine. According to public reporting, detectives obtained a search warrant for the property. That decision marked a major turning point. Search warrants are not issued without reason. Investigators must convince a judge that sufficient facts exist to justify a more extensive examination. Whatever officers had observed during the welfare check was enough to elevate their concerns. Now detectives would have an opportunity to thoroughly search the property. As investigators began executing that warrant, tension increased dramatically. Every room, every structure, every area of the property became relevant. The search was no longer focused solely on locating Patricia. It was focused on discovering the truth. Hours earlier, family members had simply wanted reassurance that Patricia was safe. Now detectives were preparing for the possibility that she was not. As the search continued, investigators moved toward a detached garage on the property. What they found there would forever change the course of the case. Inside the garage, authorities made a devastating discovery. Patricia Bennett had been found. But she was not alive. According to investigators, her body had been concealed inside a large plastic storage container. The welfare check was over. The missing person concern was over. Everything had changed. In a single moment, the entire investigation shifted direction. The question was no longer where Patricia was. The question became who had killed her. For detectives at the scene, the discovery immediately raised a host of new questions. How long had she been there? How had she died? Who knew about the concealment? And how had a woman reported missing by worried family members ended up hidden inside a storage container on her own property? Those answers would not come immediately. But investigators now knew one thing with certainty. This was no longer a welfare check. This was a homicide investigation. For Patricia's family, the discovery represented the worst possible outcome. The woman they had been desperately trying to contact was gone. The hope that she might answer the phone. The hope that she might walk through a door. The hope that there was an innocent explanation. All of it vanished the moment authorities located her body. Yet even as investigators processed the crime scene, they were beginning to uncover evidence suggesting that Patricia's death was only part of a much larger story. Because according to police, the concealment of her body was not the only effort allegedly made to hide what had happened. As detectives examined communications, financial records, and witness statements, they would begin assembling a timeline that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. A picture that would ultimately place Patricia's own daughter at the center of the investigation. And for detectives, the most difficult questions were still ahead. The discovery inside the detached garage changed everything. What had begun as a welfare check was now an active homicide investigation. The property on Congress Street immediately became a crime scene. Investigators moved quickly. Access to the area was restricted. Officers secured the property. Detectives, forensic specialists, evidence technicians, and crime scene investigators began arriving at the residence. Every minute mattered. Every detail mattered. And every piece of evidence had the potential to explain what had happened to Patricia Bennett. The first priority was preserving the scene. Investigators needed to ensure that nothing was disturbed. Nothing contaminated. Nothing overlooked. Crime scene processing is often painstakingly slow. Television dramas frequently portray investigations moving at incredible speed. The reality is very different. Detectives cannot afford assumptions. They cannot afford shortcuts. They must document everything. Photographs are taken. Measurements are recorded. Physical evidence is catalogued. Potential evidence is collected and preserved for laboratory analysis. The process can take hours. Sometimes days. And in Patricia's case, investigators were facing a scene that immediately raised troubling questions. According to public reports, Patricia's body was discovered inside a large plastic storage container located in the detached garage. The location itself became significant. Investigators needed to understand how the body arrived there. How long it had been there. And who had access to the area during the weeks leading up to the discovery. Those questions would become central to the investigation. As forensic teams examined the garage, detectives began documenting every observable detail. The container. The surrounding area. Potential trace evidence. Any indication of movement, concealment, or attempts to avoid detection. Investigators were no longer searching for Patricia. Now they were searching for answers. The condition of Patricia's remains would also become critically important. According to prosecutors, evidence suggested that Patricia had not died recently. Investigators believed she had been dead for an extended period before her body was discovered. That conclusion dramatically altered the timeline. If Patricia had been deceased for weeks, or even months, it meant family members had unknowingly been searching for someone who was already gone. It also meant investigators needed to reconstruct a much larger window of events. Every day between Patricia's last confirmed sighting and the discovery of her body became relevant. Every interaction. Every communication. Every financial transaction. Every movement. As evidence technicians continued processing the scene, detectives turned their attention toward determining how Patricia had died. That answer would ultimately come from the medical examiner. The medical examination is one of the most important components of any homicide investigation. While detectives focus on people, relationships, and motives, forensic pathologists focus on the victim. Their task is to answer questions that only the body itself can answer. How did the person die? When did they die? And what evidence can help investigators understand the circumstances surrounding that death? According to prosecutors, the medical examination revealed that Patricia Bennett had suffered a fatal gunshot wound. The finding immediately transformed the investigation. This was not a natural death. This was not an accident. This was not a medical emergency. Investigators now had evidence consistent with homicide. The significance of that conclusion cannot be overstated. A homicide determination changes the entire direction of a case. Resources increase. Investigative priorities shift. And detectives begin focusing on a new set of questions. Who had the opportunity? Who had the means? And who had the motive? As forensic findings emerged, investigators began building a timeline. When was Patricia last seen alive? Who was with her? Who had regular contact with her? Who had access to the property? And who stood to benefit from her absence? Those questions would guide every step that followed. Detectives began examining Patricia's relationships. Her family dynamics. Her communications. Her financial activity. They reviewed witness statements. They analyzed phone records. They compared timelines. And gradually, investigators began identifying individuals whose actions required closer scrutiny. One fact quickly stood out. Patricia's body had allegedly remained concealed on the property for an extended period of time. That reality naturally raised difficult questions. Who knew she was there? Who had access to the garage? Who was living at or frequently visiting the residence? And if Patricia had been dead for weeks, how had her disappearance remained hidden for so long? The answers, investigators believed, were beginning to emerge. At the same time, detectives were uncovering information that extended beyond the crime scene itself. Evidence suggested there may have been efforts to create the appearance that Patricia was still alive. Messages. Communications. Financial activity. Each new discovery added another layer to the investigation. And with every piece of evidence collected, detectives found themselves moving closer to one unavoidable conclusion. The person responsible for Patricia's death may not have been a stranger. They may not have been someone who briefly crossed her path. According to investigators, the answers appeared to lie much closer to home. As detectives continued following the evidence, their attention increasingly focused on one person. The victim's own daughter. And in the next phase of the investigation, authorities would begin examining whether Carol Rey's statements, actions, and timeline could withstand scrutiny. With the crime scene processed and the initial forensic findings documented, investigators began shifting their focus from the what of the case to the who. At this stage of a homicide investigation, detectives are guided by evidence, not assumptions. They begin narrowing down access, opportunity, and inconsistency. And in Patricia Bennett's case, one individual quickly stood out. Her daughter, Carol Rey. From an investigative standpoint, family members are always closely examined in cases involving concealed deaths or delayed discoveries. Not because of presumption of guilt, but because of proximity. Access to the victim's daily life. Knowledge of routines. And the ability to explain, or obscure, key details about the victim's final days. According to public reporting, investigators began carefully reviewing Carol Rey's statements in relation to the emerging timeline. Detectives compared what she reportedly said about Patricia's whereabouts with forensic findings from the home. They examined whether her explanations aligned with known communication patterns. And they looked for gaps, inconsistencies, or contradictions that might suggest deception or uncertainty. At the same time, investigators were also reviewing witness accounts and family statements. These accounts were compared against physical evidence collected at the scene. The goal was not only to determine what happened inside the garage, but to reconstruct the period leading up to the discovery. When all sources of information were placed side by side, investigators began identifying areas that required closer examination. One of the most significant areas of focus involved financial activity. According to public reports, detectives reviewed banking records associated with Patricia Bennett. They examined account activity during the period in which she was believed to be deceased. They looked for unusual transactions, changes in spending behavior, or any activity that might suggest someone other than Patricia was accessing her resources. Financial evidence is often a critical component in homicide investigations, particularly when concealment is suspected. It can reveal control. It can reveal timing. And sometimes, it can reveal intent. In this case, investigators reportedly identified activity that raised further questions about what was happening after Patricia's disappearance. Each transaction became a data point. Each withdrawal became a question. Each pattern became part of a broader investigative picture. As detectives continued building their case, attention naturally turned toward motive. While motive is not required to prove homicide, it often helps explain why a crime may have occurred. In Patricia Bennett's case, investigators and prosecutors explored several possible theories based on publicly available information. One area of focus was financial pressure. If someone had access to a victim's accounts after their death, it could suggest a motive tied to money or resource control. Another area of consideration was family conflict. As in many domestic investigations, relationships within the household are carefully examined for tension, disputes, or long-standing disagreements that might have escalated. Investigators also considered the possibility of personal disputes or underlying stressors that may not have been visible to extended family members. It is important to emphasize that at this stage, these were not proven facts. They were investigative theories. Lines of inquiry developed as detectives worked to understand what may have led to Patricia Bennett's death. What remained clear, however, was that Patricia's disappearance had been concealed for a significant period of time. And concealment itself often becomes a key focus in homicide investigations. Because hiding a death requires access, opportunity, and continued presence within the environment where the victim was last seen. As investigators continued analyzing the evidence, the scope of the case widened. What began as a missing person report had evolved into a complex homicide investigation involving forensic evidence, financial records, digital communications, and family statements. And at the center of it all was Carol Rey. Detectives now faced a critical question. Was she simply a grieving daughter caught in a tragic situation? Or was she someone whose actions, timeline, and access placed her directly within the scope of suspicion? The answers would begin to take shape as investigators moved into the next phase of the case, where interviews, interrogations, and formal charges would bring the investigation into the public spotlight. As the investigation progressed, detectives moved from evidence collection into one of the most critical stages of any homicide case. Interviewing the person at the center of the investigation. Carol Rey. According to standard investigative procedure, questioning in cases like this is methodical. It is not designed to accuse immediately. It is designed to clarify timelines, confirm details, and test consistency. Detectives reportedly began by asking basic questions. When was the last time Patricia was seen alive? Who last spoke with her directly? What explanation could account for her prolonged absence? And where was Carol during the critical period investigators believed Patricia had died? As the interview continued, investigators compared her responses with evidence already gathered from the scene. They cross-checked her statements against witness accounts. They reviewed phone records. They examined physical evidence timelines. And according to investigators, inconsistencies began to emerge. Small at first. Then more significant. Moments where the timeline did not align with forensic findings. Details that did not match other statements. And explanations that required clarification or correction. In homicide investigations, contradictions alone are not proof of guilt. But they often signal areas where further verification is needed. Detectives continued pressing for clarity. Efforts were made to reconcile discrepancies. Investigators sought to determine whether inconsistencies were the result of confusion, stress, or something more deliberate. As the interview process continued, attention shifted toward building probable cause. Probable cause is the legal threshold required for arrest. It must be supported by facts. Not speculation. Not assumption. But evidence that, when viewed together, establishes a reasonable belief that a crime has been committed and that a specific individual may be responsible. In this case, investigators compiled multiple categories of evidence. Physical evidence from the residence. Forensic findings related to Patricia Bennett's death. statements from individuals connected to the case, and financial records that had been reviewed during the investigation. Each piece alone told only part of the story. But together, they formed a broader investigative picture that detectives believed justified further action. As the case file expanded, law enforcement made a decision. An arrest was necessary. Once sufficient probable cause was established, authorities moved forward. Carol Rey was taken into custody in connection with the death of her mother, Patricia Bennett. The arrest marked a turning point in the case. What had begun as a welfare check and missing person investigation had now escalated into a formal homicide prosecution. Following the arrest, the news quickly spread. Local media outlets began reporting on the case. Headlines focused on the shocking nature of the allegations. A daughter accused of killing her mother. A body discovered hidden on family property. And a months-long disappearance that had gone unnoticed by the outside world. Public reaction was immediate and emotional. Many struggled to comprehend how a family relationship, typically associated with trust and care, could become the center of a homicide investigation. Neighbors expressed disbelief. Family members faced unanswered questions. And viewers following the case through media coverage tried to piece together how such a situation could unfold without detection. The shock was not only about the crime itself. It was about the context. A home. A family. A missing grandmother. And a discovery that changed everything. As the case moved into the legal system, prosecutors prepared to present their theory. Investigators had gathered evidence. Now it would be tested in court. And the final question remained. What truly happened inside the home on Congress Street? The answer, according to authorities, would be determined not only by evidence, but by what could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Following the arrest of Carol Rey, the case transitioned from active investigation into the court system. Formal charges were filed in accordance with Michigan law, including first-degree murder, along with additional charges related to the alleged concealment of Patricia Bennett's death. With the filing of charges, the role of law enforcement shifted. Detectives became witnesses. Evidence became exhibits. And the narrative of the case would now be tested under the strict standards of the judicial process. Prosecutors began outlining their theory of the case. According to the prosecution, Patricia Bennett did not simply disappear. They alleged she was killed inside the residence where she was later found. They further argued that the evidence collected during the investigation pointed toward someone within her immediate household. Specifically, her daughter, Carol Rey. Prosecutors also alleged that efforts were made to conceal what had happened. This included the reported placement of Patricia's body inside a storage container located in the garage, as well as actions that investigators believed may have been intended to delay discovery. In addition, the prosecution focused heavily on the timeline. They argued that Patricia had been deceased long before the welfare check was conducted. And that during that period, communications and other actions may have created the appearance that she was still alive. However, the defense maintained that the allegations required careful scrutiny. Under the law, Carol Rey was presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Her legal team challenged the interpretation of the evidence presented by investigators. They emphasized that forensic conclusions, timelines, and financial interpretations must be weighed carefully in court. Defense arguments, as in many homicide cases, centered on the reliability of conclusions drawn during the investigative phase. Whether timelines were accurate. Whether assumptions about intent were supported by evidence. And whether alternative explanations had been fully considered. As the case moved forward, pretrial proceedings focused on the admissibility of evidence. Courts evaluated which findings from the investigation could be presented to a jury. Which statements could be introduced. And which materials met the legal standards required for trial. Hearings were scheduled. Arguments were made. And both sides prepared for what would become the most critical stage of the case, determining guilt or innocence in a court of law. At this stage, the legal process had only just begun. And the final outcome remained unresolved. At the center of every homicide investigation is a human life. In this case, that life was Patricia Bennett. She was not simply a name in a police report. She was a mother. A grandmother. And someone whose absence left a void that her family could not ignore. Her story did not begin with a crime scene. It began with concern. A family member who noticed something was wrong. A grandson who refused to ignore silence. And a welfare check that was meant to bring reassurance. Instead, it uncovered a reality no one expected. A death that investigators say had been hidden for an extended period of time. And a case that raised difficult questions about trust, family relationships, and the warning signs that can exist behind closed doors. Beyond the courtroom and the evidence, the case also reflects broader themes often seen in domestic homicide investigations. The complexity of family dynamics. The role of financial pressure in criminal allegations. The difficulty of recognizing danger within familiar environments. And the importance of welfare checks as a safeguard for vulnerable individuals. Ultimately, this case serves as a reminder that some of the most shocking investigations do not begin with violence witnessed in public. They begin quietly. With unanswered calls. With growing concern. With silence that does not feel normal. And sometimes, a simple knock on a door can reveal truths that change everything. If you found this documentary informative, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the investigators interpreted the evidence correctly? What part of this case stood out to you the most? And if you enjoy in-depth true crime documentaries, subscribe to Dark Case Files for more investigations every week. Like and subscribe for more videos like this.